On this week's episode of Hunger Hunt Feast, I'm talking to nutritionist Chris Irvin about the benefits of a meat based diet and why we want to avoid vegetable oils at all costs. Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. With me is Chris Irvin. Chris, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks, Dane. Excited to be on today.
Yes, I'm glad to have you. I know we tried to do this earlier in the year, and it was just like we weren't matching up, and things were still nuts. But Chris is a master's in nutrition and exercise science, correct?
Yeah. So I got my master's in exercise and nutrition science at the University of Tampa.
Awesome. Okay. And you are, avid writer and also education director at I'm sorry, I'm blanking on that one. It's
Yeah,
the
perfect keto.
Perfect Keto. That's right. Okay, I kept going back to your handle, the ketologist. Like, no, not a ketologist. Perfect Keto, which you guys make meal replacements, correct? A lot of
Yeah,
keto
so
snacks, stuff like that.
yeah, we're getting more into snacks now. When Perfect Keto first started, it was more of a supplement company. So
Okay.
our first products were exogenous ketones, collagen, MCT oil powder, and then we started getting a little bit more into snack products with like keto bars, keto cookies. By the time this podcast come out, we'll have had a couple new snack products coming out, a granola bar that we just finished R&Ding. So we're definitely starting to get more into that snack realm. So I'd say we're in between that supplement snack business.
Gotcha. Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to bring you on because if anyone has seen what I share on Instagram, I do a lot of your stuff on stories, a lot of your images, a lot of your, I don't call them memes because they're not say comedic, but they're your images that really communicate information pretty easily about food, about animal-based products, things to avoid. Um, Share a lot on my stories because it's just they just really get the message across very, very well. And so I knew not only we were on the same page, but I knew you knew how to communicate. You knew your stuff.
Right.
So I was anxious to
Well, I
get you on here.
appreciate that stuff too. The sharing of content is, for a content producer, that's like one of the most humbling things to have somebody do is to share it with their audience. So I always appreciate that.
Oh yeah, same. I get it. I totally get it. But I just love the images because I honestly not great at making those things. But you've been able to put some great ones together that really communicate quickly. Like in the scroll, it's hard to get that communicated sometimes and catch someone's eye. And so you've done a great job with that. So I would definitely, I will mention your handle again, but if anyone's listening to this, check out at the ketologist on Instagram and you'll see what I'm talking about. But let's dig into the nutrition here. You are primarily, like we mentioned keto, but keto and carnivore, really animal based nutrition, correct?
Yeah, for sure. When I first really started getting into nutrition and nutrition research, I started out studying a lot of keto low carb dieting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I probably first got into it, I was probably pretty dogmatic about keto and thinking, its application and how most people should be doing it and everything like that. Now I look at keto a little bit more like as a tool that, it's a good fit for very certain use cases and things like that. But just through low carb research, I've definitely started to get a lot more into carnivore and then just meat in general, right? I mean, when you're talking about low carb dieting, you're cutting out a whole food group. That means you're focusing on other food groups, and that inherently becomes protein and fat. So, yeah, a
Right.
lot of research to animal based dieting, and then subsequently a lot of plant based dieting research because of that.
Oh yeah, you gotta look at both, don't you? You gotta understand where what the alternative is and some of the downside of that we're getting pitched. I mean, so as you coming through school, I mean, you're not. I didn't see RD or CNS next to your name, so you haven't got the. So coming through school, I mean, I know nutrition education is very is not really keto friendly. It's not really carnivore friendly. Um, Nutrition Academy is backed by General Mills and ConAgra and Pepsi, basically the biggest processed food producers in the country. So, you're really, you're way outside the box of what your academic education, really was from college, I would assume, correct?
Yeah, for undergrad, yes, but
Okay.
for graduate school, not so much. So in undergrad, yeah, I was more of a biology major, but I had to take some nutrition classes. I was definitely given the traditional dietary food guidelines, low fat
Mhm.
dieting, whole grains, all of that stuff. No cholesterol. But then my graduate schooling at University of Tampa, that's actually where I was introduced to keto at. And I actually
Mm.
spent my time there. Like my first sports nutrition class at the University of Tampa was where I was introduced to keto, and it was talking about keto for endurance performance. So that was a program that was a little bit more up to date with the research. And that kind of led to me actually being able to study keto in the lab setting when I was in grad school. I was studying keto for like in athletes as well as different like therapeutic applications of the diet, which was really cool.
Well, that's refreshing to hear. Let me
Yeah.
tell you,
But
that's
it's
good to
very
hear.
fair. You're very right, though, that is not a common. I get people ask me all the time. They'll say, do you think that it's valuable for me to go on for continuing education for nutrition? And I always say that my experience, it was a great thing. I was able to learn a lot, but there's few and far between programs out there that are actually up to date with the information. And same thing with those certifications out there for nutrition as well. There's not a lot of great stuff out there, so I was very fortunate.
Yeah, you are. You are, because that is rare. You really can't find too many programs that would embrace keto,
Right.
at all, let alone or look at low carb studies in the setting of taking them seriously. Because they've just been really until like the last maybe 5 to 10 years, there really hasn't been any serious look at meta-analysis or separating out the trans fats from the saturated fats in a lot of those old studies where we had it was the effects of trans fats causing the negative outcomes and blaming animal fat. I mean, is that what you found as well? Is that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, really, it was, keto, you're right. The boom of keto back probably 5, 6 years ago when it really started to hit mainstream, that
Mhm.
kind of opened the book back up on this topic because it really was closed for like the last 30 years. It was basically high cholesterol. Eating cholesterol and eating fat is really bad for you. You need to be low fat, low cholesterol, low saturated fat,
Right.
with very little understanding of like the actual mechanisms and why we think that versus what's actually going on in the body. And keto kind of inherently opened the book back up on this because it was like, okay, how are all these people seeing results on a high fat diet? There must be something more going on. And that's what I think has led to more researchers start looking in and saying, oh, these studies that we were looking at before were deeply flawed because, like you said, we weren't teasing out the difference between a trans fat and a saturated fat, or
Mm.
the even the combination of high fat dieting with high carb dieting, right? I mean, that was always a big problem in research was
For sure.
saying, hey, high fat diet. And then you look at it and it was like, well, no, that was a standard American diet, high fat, high carb,
The balanced diet.
Yes, that's right. That's
Well
right.
balanced between protein and fat and carbs, and the protein's like, and yeah. So yeah, those two in combination, you essentially have a processed food. I mean, that's what a donut is, isn't it? High fat, high carb.
Exactly. And it's like, and what we know, if you even just looking, at the simple biochemistry of the body, we know that that's one of the worst combinations we can have,
Yes.
especially when that fat is more of a trans fat or it is a, high omega-6 fat,
Hmm.
which is what most of the, our population is consuming today. So
For sure.
definitely, this stuff is counterproductive or counterintuitive to what everybody else is saying.
Right. Right. So you are real, I would say, I mean, you're part of the spearhead of that changing in your education program was part of the educate was really spearheading that, obviously, because I still think that's, again, hard to find. There's not too many great certifications around that, but they're very small. NTP, like, Weston Price Foundation based one, that's obviously a great one. But what you're doing, I mean, you create content. So you write books, you do research,
Mhm.
blog posts, you're doing education for Perfect Keto.
Mhm.
So you are, I mean, up to your eyeballs in research is what it sounds like most of the time. I mean, you're looking this stuff up for to base your content, correct?
Yeah, for sure. And, admittedly, there hasn't really been a whole lot of new research coming out on a lot of this stuff. Most of my graduate school and the first couple of years after graduate school was spent really diving into the research. And, now there might be like a new meta-analysis or systematic review that comes out and rehashes some things. But, a lot of the stuff that we know now is it's kind of out there and it's pretty well set in stone. So, most of what I focus on now is, one, still taking that in and making sure I'm up to date when something new happens, but
Hmm.
more trying to figure out what's the best way to get this message across to people, right?
Yeah.
The information has always been, and this was kind of something I realized in grad school, is that the information has always been there. We've known about keto since the 20s. That's when it first really started popping up in research. But our
Right.
ability to, as a general population, to access that information and actually read it and interpret it and apply it to our lives is very little, right? So,
Right.
that's kind of more what I lean into is trying to see, how do you break down this information simply so that somebody understands it and they can actually apply it and get something out of it? And that's, that's kind of what my goal day to day is.
Oh yeah. Well, and as a coach, like I know with coaching my clients, that really is it. It's like they're not going to read a study. They're
Right.
not going to go through and look through and see whether there's flaws in the study. They're not going to follow references. So it's taking something sort of complex and simplifying it into something someone can digest and run with confidently, so
Right.
that they stick with it. And so that, I guess that really is what you do, is you translate it, so to speak, into something that's consumable.
Yeah, and it's, I don't think I used to think that education was like one of the biggest, predictors of success for
mm,
people. And when you start looking into more human behaviors, you kind of see that for most people, education is a little bit lower of a motivator compared to other things. But I still think that there's a component to education where if you can just have a basic understanding of what's going on,
right.
like, you look at low carb dieting, and it's like if you can have a basic understanding of what blood sugar is and what insulin is and what happens when you're on a standard American diet versus when you're on a low carb diet. Just having that basic understanding, I think, can help with adherence more, because now when you go and you have a donut, to start your day, or you go through Starbucks and you get a low fat, high carb sandwich with a 80 grams of sugar coffee, like you kind of know what's going on in your body. And I think that plays a big role in people's success. And I'm sure you see that as a coach too, right? I mean, if people don't know what they're doing is wrong, then they're not really going to be able to make any changes.
Right. Or they're just confused because they're getting mixed messages all over the place. Yeah. So getting the message out really is the big deal, especially when we have still a lot of medical professionals still preaching, that my doctor said I eat more whole grains and stay away from red meat. And it's like, look at your doctor. Let's look at your doctor. Let's see his doctor. Let's see your doctor's blood work, please.
Right. So that's something I've seen that so much with like my grandpa. I've told this story a couple times, but like my grandfather's doctor is, has been somebody who's told him for years that he should eat, no more than 1 egg a week, right? Like, because the cholesterol is going to kill him, and he really needs to keep his sodium intake low, and has to focus on being low fat and all this stuff. And you're right. I mean, one of the things that my grandpa always says about him is that he's like in the worst shape. Like, this guy looks like he's about to go any moment. He's not a picture of health at all. And those, he probably hasn't looked at any information or new research since he became a doctor 40, 50
Right.
years ago. So that is one of the biggest issues too, is that there's not a lot of accountability for these professionals to update their views on things, and to have their views challenged, right? It's like, it's one of those professions where we're very okay with people just kind of being dogmatic and sticking to what they think they know. So
Mm-hmm.
hopefully that's an area that we can start to see some improvements into.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's dig into a little bit. So when people think of meat, and when you think of a carnivore diet, the first question I think, well, where do you get your nutrients? Where do you get your micronutrients? Where do you get all the things? What about the veggies? Don't I need my vitamins and minerals? And they don't quite realize that those nutrients are very available in animal products.
Mhm.
So um, how do you? I mean, let's unpack that. I mean, you got the master's degree. I'm gonna let you lead on that one, because people here are tired of hearing me talk. So I want you know give us a little. How do people get their nutrients? I mean, where's that going to come from? In what are their best animal based micronutrient sources? Let's go with
Right.
that. Simplified.
Yeah, and I love this question, because I was actually just recording a podcast yesterday with Dr. Gustin, and we were talking about this, where, when we prepare a meal or we plan a meal, we plan the meat as the main part of it, because that's where we think about our nutrients coming from. And
Right.
if you are eating like a vegetable or a side, it's just kind of, it's just kind of putting it along with it, right? And sometimes it's almost out of habit. Like, I don't really look at that as being like, oh, I'm eating these greens for like these nutrients, and that's not to say that they don't have nutrients. It's just that what's the meat is going to be what moves that needle a lot more. So
For
to
sure.
go into that a little bit, the biggest factor here is bioavailability, or absorption of nutrients. So
Hmm.
us as humans, we have a digestive system that's more conducive of extracting the nutrients and the vitamins out of meat than we are plant food. So there's some studies out there with different minerals. We'll see on an animal-based diet, or when we're eating meat, we'll be absorbing 80 to 95% of the nutrients found in those meats. Whereas with plants, it can be as low as 5 to 15%. And that doesn't even take into consideration some of the anti-nutrients that come in some of these plant-based foods that block the absorption of nutrients. So
Right.
it's, and when you look at meat too, everybody kind of thinks like, okay, well, sure, meat has a lot of nutrients in it, but it can't have everything that I need. And realistically, it does. I mean, especially red. And when we're saying meat here, I'm predominantly talking about red meat.
Mhm.
Chicken, turkey, a lot lower in nutrient content. Good
Mhm.
sources of protein, but a lot lower nutrient content. Pork is okay, but still a lot lower. But ruminant animals and red meat, that's really that's where you can get the most of your nutrients. And when we talk about the most nutrient dense foods, organ meat has to come to mind, right? I mean,
Right.
liver, kidney, heart. Those are just I mean, these are literally multivitamins. Is how you can look at these things. I mean, you can get everything. You look at the back of your daily multivitamin that you might be taking, and you can get all of that in your organ meat, and you can get it in a fashion that you can absorb better. And
For
I
sure.
think the key thing too with that is kind of understanding the difference in digestive systems is, when we talk about a ruminant animal is a cow, for instance. It's an animal that has a different digestive system. They have multiple parts of their digestive system. And these animals' digestive systems allow them to consume plant products, break those plant products down, absorb those nutrients, and then harness those nutrients in their muscle meat. So they have a digestive system that allows them to do that. Where us as humans, we're monogastric. We only have one stomach. We're not able to do this as effectively. But because of the way that our biochemistry is, I mean, we are not that we have to necessarily be carnivore. I think that humans are probably at baseline omnivores.
Mhm.
But we are carnivores in the sense that we can get the bulk of our nutrients that we need from animals and from meat.
That's the acid-based part in the small intestine, correct? Or the first part of our digestive tract is
Yeah.
acid-based, so that's what allows us to extract those, as opposed to, like, say, in a ruminant, where you have primarily a bacteria has some small acid base there, but it's primarily bacterial based, like a fermentation, right? Are you cutting out
Yep.
a little bit?
Yeah, I just had a quick delay on you, but you're back in, so I can hear
Okay,
you. But
so
you're right. So
animals more fermentation based, where we have a kind of an early acid based. I think that's
yes,
the
yeah,
difference.
and admittedly, I'm not an expert on the digestive system. That's kind of as far as my knowledge goes on that area.
Okay.
But yeah, the fermentation part, that is a big thing for the ruminants. They're able to take plants and break them down into short chain fatty acids, and they can actually, because of the way that their body is able to digest and ferment foods, they're able to create things like saturated fats and cholesterol and stuff out of these plant-based nutrients, which
Mhm.
is something that we just can't do as humans.
Right. No, we can't. We'd starve actually living on grass, right? So,
And yeah, and that's the thing that's really cool is, like a ruminant animal can basically take a very nutrient poor food as it relates to us,
right.
and can really even take like garbage and convert that into something. I mean, even grain fed, even though that's not the best approach for a ruminant animal, they can even turn garbage grains into some form of nutrition that we can use, which is, it is pretty crazy that they're able to do that. So
Right.
um, I think we need to leave the plant eating to the ruminants and the meat eating to us.
Right. I agree. It's much tastier.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about, organ meat being so nutrient dense, a lot of people think, oh, organs are, they're filters. They catch all the toxins. They have a lot of toxins in them. And then obviously it's quite the opposite, right? We have a lot more antioxidants there.
Mhm.
So you're talking about nutrient, treat them like vitamins. I mean, I actually eat some liver almost every day, like a few ounces of it, just treat it like a vitamin.
Yep.
But the nutrient quality compared to a plant is, like you said, it's much denser and more bioavailable. Is that
Yep, exactly.
okay?
Yeah, which is just better absorbed as a
Right.
less specific term for that.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So what would your, like, when you're looking at a meal, you said you focus on the meat part, and is
Mhm.
there so do you include organ meat? Is that like a daily thing with you usually?
Yeah, I would say not usually daily. I would say like 3 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what we do, so me and my wife, we eat most of our meals together. And before I was living with her and everything, I would just eat. I would cook up, or even sometimes just eat it raw. Just chop up liver and just eat it, right? Not so, and that was something I would do more frequently. Not
Right.
something that she's obviously is down with. So
Right.
what we do is we have a couple nights a week where we'll do we use the organ meat blends, which highly recommend for anybody who is, because organ meat, admittedly, it does have a pretty harsh taste. And for
Yeah.
everybody who's freaking out about the raw part, it actually tastes a lot better raw, because when you cook it, it brings out this like pungent flavor that is,
Right.
most people can't tolerate. So that is the reason why, sometimes you can go the raw approach. But these blends that they have, they can be somewhere between like a 50-50 blend of organ meat versus just ground meat, which, you still get some of that organ meat taste, but you can really easily incorporate that into really any recipe that calls for like a ground beef.
Sure.
You can put that in there. So what we'll do is like 2 or 3 nights a week, we'll make like a stew, or, maybe like a chili. Or last night we made these lettuce wrapped tacos, where we just seasoned the meat with, taco seasonings, and then, put a little bit of, shredded cheese from the farmer's market on it, and some other vegetables and stuff. So that's, I would say 2-3 times a week is how often I'm trying to get it in, which, I think that, I've really had a hard time figuring out what's most optimal for that. Right. It's like, is it better to have a couple big feedings of it
Mhm.
throughout the week, or is it better to be having it every single day? I've never really found anything that definitively says one way or the other. So
Sure.
I would tell people, probably best just to make sure that you're getting it in. And, one of the things that you'll notice too, like when you start eating a little bit healthier and you start including these foods that are so nutrient dense,
Mhm.
if you stop eating them, you're going to feel so much better on that, that if you're not getting enough and you stop eating them, you're going to start feeling, some like back to the way you used to feel before you were doing that. And it will be more noticeable. So a lot of times you can go off a feel with stuff like that too. And it's like, hey, if I'm fatiguing in my workouts now, or, I'm not sleeping as good at night, or my recovery is bad, that's probably a sign that you're new.
Mm.
Listen to your body a lot.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's true. That's a good way to look at it. You're missing something. Do you include much like sardine, like small fish, like sardines or bivalves, oysters, clams, that kind of thing, to get other nutrients, get a variety of nutrients in there? Or
Yeah, for sure. So, I definitely do salmon. So fatty fish,
Mhm.
we try to incorporate that a couple times a week as well. I would say the two biggest ones that I will do is salmon and sardines.
Okay.
I will do oysters and things like that on occasions, but not as often as I should. That's kind of one of those things I wish I focused a little bit more on that. But I do consistently get in, the sardines, salmon, and then salmon roe as well is something that I will try to get in my diet too.
Oh yeah, that's a real nutrient dense
Oh
thing.
yeah,
It's amazing that,
yeah,
and these are things that used to be part of our diet, like human diet, traditionally, right? I mean,
yeah,
even not that far back. We don't have to be like true hunter gatherer, Hudza hunting, and um, to have been eating this way. We're talking about just traditional diets in every continent where there was, um, they just relied more. They used more of their resources. They didn't throw things away,
right.
essentially, right?
Yeah, for sure. And like there are some cultures out there who definitely had to eat more plant-based and really high plant-based, just based off of what was available to them. I mean, we're a part of only a few generations that's able to eat food from all over the world. Before these last few generations, you would eat locally. It was whatever was available to you. Now,
Right.
for most people, that would mean only seasonal access to, and again, depending on where you were, but only seasonal access to plants, but
Right.
probably yearly access to meat and protein and fat and things like that. So I'd say that for the majority of people, their ancestors probably were eating a lot of meat, and with periods of probably incorporating some plants, incorporating some fruits, some tubers, some nuts, things like that. But
Mhm.
with the exception of just a few had access to plant-based foods, our ancestors definitely had a lot of meat.
Yes, and it wasn't, and that was not killing them. That was not
No.
what was killing them or causing their short life expectancy. So this, and I know this seems like old hat to you. I know you even again, you studied keto in college. You are, that's a rare exception. I have to tell you, and
Yeah.
you know that, but there's still a lot of people who think that meat, because of some epidemiological studies that are out there, meat causes cancer, meat causes heart disease, meat, even has been blamed for diabetes of all things.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you speak to that? So when you're confronted with that, what's the best way you found to address that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the biggest thing, like you said, is to kind of point out that a lot of that research is epidemiological, and one of the issues is that, and for people who, if that they're not familiar with that word, epidemiology is a body of research where you're basically studying a group of people, and you're studying, just you're monitoring what they're doing. You're maybe having them report on things, and then you're looking for, different things that correlate with each other, right? And the way
Mhm.
that epidemiology is supposed to be used is that you're supposed to take those correlations and you're supposed to dig in deeper to find out, if they actually pan out when you dig deeper, right? So, do like doing a randomized controlled trial, or even just doing like a pilot study where you're actually looking at an individual and you're, controlling the experiment and whatnot.
Mhm.
Uh, but that's not really what happened with a lot. Oh, I'm drawing a blank on it now. It's over here. The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz is a really great book that kind of goes through
Oh
the
yeah.
history of this. And she talks a lot about how at the time when you hear about Ansel Keys and all these people that kind of were first responsible for demonizing fat and have really controlled even the nutrition recommendations that we still have today, there was a need for them to kind of rush this research. There was there was an increase going on in cardiovascular disease, and there was a lot of fear about it, and there needed to be a solution to it. And fat was this thing that got demonized. And when we start to look at the issues with using these epidemiological studies as truth, is that there's so many things that they don't take into consideration. So just to give like an example, if we were you see a headline somewhere that says red meat linked to prostate cancer,
Right.
and that's the headline that you see on Facebook, right? And that's the thing that you share, and for most people that's where the reading stops. But then you click on that and you read the actual study, and what it was is it was an observational study where they took men who were diagnosed with prostate cancer, and at the time of their diagnosis have them answer a questionnaire about what they eat. And if a high percentage of those men reported that they eat hamburgers frequently, then now we have this correlation between potentially this correlation between red meat and prostate cancer. But what that doesn't take into consideration is, were they eating processed carbs with that red meat? Were they drinking alcohol? Were they smokers? Were they, living a sedentary lifestyle? We miss out on all those things, right? So,
Right.
and again, we kind of touched on it briefly earlier, but the problem with saturated fat and cholesterol and all those things isn't when it's consumed by itself. It's when it's consumed as a part of a high inflammatory, high processed carb diet. That's when, in a diet that is frequently spiking our blood sugar, which is the standard American diet. So, if we look at, standard American, we probably will see a pretty high intake of saturated fat, or just fat in general. But the majority of those fats are low quality, unhealthy fats with, in conjunction with these other processed foods. So, when you look at the research and you start isolating out saturated fat and you start isolating out just fat and protein in general, and you start looking at more of, a whole food, real diet where we're eating, plants and animals, and not a lot of packaged foods, we just don't see those same problems. And,
Mhm.
and the other thing too is we have to, the cholesterol conversation is a real big part of this too. We, similarly to how we assumed that fat would make us fat,
Mhm.
we assumed that eating a lot of cholesterol would
Right.
increase cholesterol. And when you look at the physiology of the body, we kind of know that when you get a cholesterol test done, a very high percentage of that cholesterol is cholesterol that's produced by the body, not cholesterol that's from what you ate.
Right.
So that's another big thing for people to realize too. And even then, our guidelines for what the optimal range is for cholesterol levels, those are based off of studying usually sick and unhealthy people, for one. And two, we just don't really have a great understanding of those things, right? So for somebody
Right.
to say, like a blood test, you go in somewhere and we say, all right, your LDL is higher than what the recommended range is for it. That means, we should put you on a statin. But what that doesn't tell you, it's like, did you look at the inflammatory levels of the person, or did you look at all these other factors that you should have to use to determine if that high LDL level is actually warranted for a statin, or can actually cause a health concern. And
Sure.
that's what we don't so often do. So, that's a long-winded way of saying that a lot of times now, when doctors and stuff are giving recommendations on nutrition, it's not research that they've had to do themselves. I mean, the average doctor, I think, spends like less than 5 hours having to study like nutrition in their,
Correct.
during doctorate. So,
Yeah.
uh, back to see that that's, a lot of what we're recommending now is 60 years old and based on bad science. So,
Mhm.
uh, and and then another thing that's, I think, important for people to understand is that, why hasn't this changed? Well, a couple of reasons. One of industry ties to a lot of the education and governing bodies out there. So, you're talking about General Mills and all Kellogg's and all these different companies
Right.
that have deep ties into our educating bodies. So that's one. But then another one is, there's research costs money, and there's not much of a return that you can get on fasting and low carb dieting and eating
Right.
more meat, right? There's not, that's not, very sexy research for somebody who wants to invest in science, right? So that's another reason why we see such a slow, like, we saw very booming research supporting, whole grains, because there was a big industry behind that. But we
Right.
don't unfortunately see the same thing with low carb dieting. So it's going to take a while for things to change.
And so now the marketing push and the money obviously is behind plant-based diets
Yep.
and even fake meats, like these whatever's in there, but there's some mixture of plant fats, seed vegetable oils, and just process. It's basically a processed food.
Yes, absolutely.
Um,
Highly processed too. I would consider there's different levels of classifying processed foods. I would consider them to be ultra processed, which is at the top.
oh yeah, multiple. I mean, more ingredients than you have fingers, basically, and the highly inflammatory products in them. I mean, basically, or industrial products. Some of them, you and I would call industrial products. They're called food products. But let's talk about some of those. So, what would you? I mean, everyone knows sugar is bad. Too much sugar. What has been sold to us as an alternative to saturated fat is, of course, vegetable fats, vegetable oils, the
Yeah.
canola, corn, soy being like the king of all, to save us from meat.
Right.
Cottonseed was probably the early one with Crisco. We, canola is heart healthy because it's got omega-3s in it. People leaving out the erucic acid, of the original rapeseed being,
Yeah.
causing heart lesions. We, I'm going to let you go with this one because tell us what in your research. I mean, was that stuff that you got to get into, or is that something you go into now with your the your perfect keto? Do you
Yeah.
explain to people what to look for? Because they're obviously, if they're doing keto, they're going to be looking at different types of foods with different ingredients, right?
For sure. Yeah. When I first got into nutrition research, it was all, about sugar. That was really what I was focusing on, was low carb research. And over the last couple of years, I've kind of really started to turn my attention more to these vegetable oils, the omega-6 fats, the linoleic acid. And, it's one of the most underestimated or underappreciated contributors to disease that we have in our society. When you start looking at, one, how many foods that it's in. So you mentioned the fake meat. That's a big one, but most packaged foods have seed oils in them.
Oh yeah.
And most times when you go to a restaurant, they're cooking your food in a seed oil. And the
Mhm.
reason why these seed oils are an issue is because, one, they're omega-6 fats, right? They're linoleic acid, which, a big predictor of our health overall, our heart health, everything, is our omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in our body. And the average human nowadays, it's like a 20-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is a huge problem. This is why we see, high rates of inflammation, which drives so many of these diseases. And a lot of that does have to do with the fact that we're consuming so many of these oils. And the reason why, these oils you talk about, like even like a peanut oil or, all these different types of omega-6s, if they were consumed in their whole food form, like peanuts, for instance,
Mm.
a lot different because they're coming with other nutrients that help balance a lot of things. There's a lot of biochemistry to that, but they're coming, they're in their whole food form, and it's a lot different. But when you're talking about in its oil form, you have to extract these fats from these whole food products, leaving you, and these extraction methods are very high heat extraction methods. They oxidize these fats, they damage them. So already before you've even consumed this fat, this is a damaged fat not found in its whole food form. And then on top of that, it's an omega-6 that you're taking in that's, going to be driving that imbalance between your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. But then, the really interesting thing that happens here is that linoleic acid, which is the primary omega-6 that we're talking about here. This is like the way that people look at sugar and how we should keep sugar out of our diet or keep it really low. That's
Mm.
how we should be looking at linoleic acid, is knowing, all right, which foods are high in linoleic acid and we should keep those low. Linoleic acid, when we take it in, it can cause insulin resistance at the cell. So it can cause our cells to, stop responding to insulin, which makes us, carb intolerant, which, can mean that we keep eating carbs, we start getting obese. Linoleic acid can be the cause of that. And it can even communicate to our fat cells to absorb and hold on to more fat. So it's a huge driver of obesity as well.
Wow.
So this linoleic acid it's a crazy thing, and it's really interesting too, because we look at how we recommend people to not eat saturated fat and to
Right.
eat more. They're not saying linoleic acid, but when you're replacing an animal fat with a plant fat, you are replacing saturated fat with linoleic acid is essentially what's going on here. And it's funny that your body will actually, if you don't eat saturated fat, your body will produce it because it needs it. It's a very important fat for you to have. Your body is not producing linoleic acid when you don't eat it because it's not in. So even right there, if we just look at what our body does, we can kind of know that, like, okay, why are we cutting out this thing that our body clearly is okay with and uses and needs, and replacing it with this thing that it doesn't have any indication that we need it, and there's so much reason to cut it out, right? So it's a really big issue. And you talked about the plant-based foods out there. I personally, I don't think that a plant-based diet is most optimal for somebody, for most humans to follow. But there's different types of plant-based diets, and the whole food plant-based diet is, that's something that can work for people. And I do have a lot of friends who have seen incredible, health improvements for that. And we can talk about why I think it's not as cut and dry. But the plant-based diet that is consuming a ton of processed, plant-based foods and eating fake meat,
Yeah.
this is just as bad as the standard American diet. You look at one of these. I remember the first time that I actually ate a plant-based burger. I was at a restaurant here in St. Pete, and this was probably 4 years ago. And I think it was Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger, and I had never heard of it before. And I was at a restaurant, and there was like a Beyond Burger salad. So I ordered it. I was like, oh, burger salad. This is that's looked like the best thing on the menu. So I was like, let's get it. So I get it, and it comes out, and first thing, it's super red in the middle, which I do eat my meat rare usually, but they didn't ask. So that was kind of my first red flags. Like, that's weird that they would not ask and just serve me a a burger pretty raw. And then I took a bite of it, and I was like, it's like it's kind of spongy. Like it kind of tastes like meat, but it just doesn't really have that texture. And then I remember looking up and seeing a shirt in the corner that said like "I love vegans" or something like that.
Oh
And
no.
and then it kind of like dawned on me, like, wait a minute. So I look up, I pull out my phone and I look up Impossible Burger, and I see the ingredient list, and it's, gluten and wheat and soy and canola oil and, all these things that I'm like, I would never want to put any single one of these things in my body, let alone, all of them at the same time.
Right.
So it's really disgusting. And the thing I think that people really need to understand with this is that we've only just spoken about the nutrition part of this, right? Some people do plant-based dieting and they eat fake meat because they think it's healthier, and that's just not the case. But you also get a lot of people out there who do it because they think it's better for the environment, and they think that it's better for better for just ethically, right? That it's better because it's not killing as many animals and things like that. And both of those two things aren't correct either. The ingredients that are needed to produce these burgers, they are highly industrialized ingredients that have to come from monocropping cultures that really destroy our environment,
Right.
and not only destroy our environment but also do take the lives of plenty of animals too. I mean, when you're talking about up to 30 to 40 field animals die per like acre of monocropped land to get your soy and all these different things, that's a lot more than the the one cow that probably has to die to feed my family for like the whole year, right? So
Right.
this conversation, there's a lot of nuance to it, and I think that's been the most surprising thing for me, is that a lot of, when I first got into this, I thought it was just a misunderstanding of the nutrition, right? That people think this is healthy. Surely if we convince them, or if not convince them, but display to them why it's not healthy, then people will change. And then now it became all these other things where it's oh, now people are telling me that it's better for the environment, or it's better for animals don't have to die and things like that, and it's just not the case.
Correct. Yeah. It actually depletes the soil, and there's nothing to, like, we need animals to replenish our soil with nutrients. We need that part in our ecosystem for it to actually work, with sun,
Correct.
plants, and ruminants. Really, I mean, the ruminants really being the focal point, or a cornerstone, I guess, really, of turning those nutrients back into the soil, and keeping them sequestered.
For sure.
Yeah. And we're, as opposed to just taking, and then pouring it back in a chemical based fossil fuel based nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides and all these kind of stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, and it's it's a such a big conversation. And for anybody who's into that, like, we don't have to go down that rabbit
Right.
hole here, but Sacred Cow by Rob Wolf and Deanna Rogers is a really great book on this that kind of gives you all the science behind it. And it even, and because a big part of this too is that there's issues with factory farming of
Sure.
animals too, right? Like, there now it is overblown, and there's a lot of research on there about how we've kind of misinterpreted that too. But there's a lot of nuance with this conversation, and that's a really great book to kind of just really lay it all out there for you. So anybody who's interested in the environmental impact of their food choices, got to
Yeah.
check that one out.
Yeah, I actually had Diana on in November, I
Oh,
believe.
nice.
Yeah, right before the she was like in that sneak peek phase of the documentary, of the Sacred Cow
Yeah,
documentary, right before it was launched.
yeah,
So it was, yeah, and really just they did a great job of showing every aspect of, from nutrition to environmental aspects of meat versus the and regenerative farming and so forth. So again, yeah, we don't have to rehash all of that, but it's been well done by them.
yeah.
It's just it, it's been made, it gets marketed as taste, and it seems like it shifts to, like you said, to the environment. These shifted, but when it comes down to nutrition, if someone's really looking for what's the best thing I can do to stay alive and stay healthy as long as possible, how would you compartmentalize that into just a handful of, like, here's how, when you're looking at your plate, here's
Mhm.
what you want to look for? I mean, is, I know you don't coach one-on-one much, but I mean, you coach coaches, so I know you've got to be able to communicate this, um, real simple action steps for people, and knowing that be confident they're going to get all the nutrition that they
Mhm.
require. They're going to get their magnesium and calcium and all these things that we think come from sources other than meat.
Mhm.
How can they like baby steps?
Yeah. So, I mean, the easiest thing that you can do is just start adding 4 to 5 ounces of a protein source, depending on your size. So, probably 4 to 8 ounces, depending on who
Hmm.
you are, of a meat source to your meals. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Like, of the, in the coaching program that I have, and we see a lot of the clients that go through there, a lot of them are eating, lower carb. They're eating a lot of, plants, a lot of salads, but their protein intake is really low, and which, subsequently makes their nutrient intake very low.
Right.
And a lot of times we have to remember with nutrition, it's not just about what we take out of the diet, it's what we put in it that matters too. So replace that with something. So I think the
Mhm.
simplest thing for most people to do is trying to add 4 to 8 ounces of a red meat ruminant animal protein source to your meal. I think is a big thing. And really just, if we were really to simplify the what to do to live longer, I would say that it's just focusing on eating fresh local foods. I think that when we eat fresh local foods and what's available to us in our local environments, we eat foods that are a little bit more like what a human is supposed to eat, right? Like, if you are fortunate enough to have access to a farmer's market, if you get your food from the farmer's market, you are going to be lower carb, you are going to be higher nutrient intake, you're going to have all of these things. So
Mhm.
that's kind of a really simple way to look at it, I think, is that, if you, like, again, you live in an area where you're fortunate enough to have a farmer's market, I know not everybody does,
Right.
go there and eat what is there seasonally. And doing that, you're gonna get to try some awesome new foods, but you're also going to be eating what you should be eating anyway.
Mhm. Gotcha. How much? That's a good question. People always ask me how much protein, how much. So, I mean, and I know with keto, it can vary. There's a time when keto was very like lower protein, very high fat, carbs were low, and then there's some give and take in there. And carnivore tends to be very much more high protein because you're looking at, you're not eating bacon all the time. You're eating fats with, protein that has a little less fat than, say, a bacon or an egg. So what is that usually? I mean, within a spectrum, obviously there's not like hard line numbers, but where do you usually direct people as far as if they're looking at, say, what's my macros, which you hate to lead with that, right? Because you want nutrient density, but what's a good kind of realm or window that they should be looking at? I mean, you mentioned 48 ounces, 4 to 8 ounces of red meat each meal, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, what I typically recommend for most people is like a gram of protein per pound of body weight. I
Okay.
really think and that is, it is pretty high for what most people would consider, and it is a lot higher than what you would probably end up on a traditional keto diet.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't think most people need to follow the what's been laid out for how keto is, with the 20 to 25% of your protein coming from, or 20 to 25% of your calories coming from protein. I think that's far too low for most people. I think, when you're talking about epilepsy potentially, and some of those therapeutic uses of it, maybe there's, some value to that. But for most of us who are, just following keto to feel better and have more energy and lose weight, I think that getting that protein up closer to 30 to 40% of your calories, and more like a gram per pound of body weight, I think is a great place to start.
Awesome. Yeah, that's what I try to shoot for. I find it difficult with eating that much meat. You know what I mean? Especially if I have like an intermittent fasting schedule that day, or a lower, it's like that's a big meal of protein. I'm definitely often eating more than what would be in 8 ounces of meat. I'm eating 6 ounces of meat and some liver and 4 eggs, and
Yeah.
uh,
Very hard to eat in a calorie surplus, or even at a calorie baseline with carnivore, because not only, like, you only really have one type of food you can eat, but then the other issue is that you don't have much hunger on carnivore. At least in my experience, hunger is
no.
completely checked. So I mean, most times when I would do like a carnivore stint, it's usually like an OMAD carnivore, where it's like I eat one time a day, because it's like I'm just not hungry otherwise. So I often, if I'm doing carnivore, I don't focus on protein intake as much, just because I know I'm really, like, I'm going to be force feeding myself to get there, and that's not really enjoyable either. Uh,
Okay.
so that's why I don't typically maintain carnivore all the time. I
Okay.
will cycle out of it to start getting other foods in to keep those calories up.
Okay. So those added calories help you have more of an appetite and help you eat a little bit more.
Well, just blood sugar is not quite as stable, right? So, like,
Right.
even if you're consuming, low glycemic carbs, you're still going to be getting a little bit more fluctuation in your blood sugar, which can inherently stimulate a little bit more, just a little bit more hunger. But then, the other thing is too, is when you're introducing a lot of these other foods, even low glycemic plants, you talk about palatability, right? So when
Right.
you're eating just meat, and especially if you're not really seasoning it, I mean, there's really not much flavor. Like, even though I love meat, there's not a ton of flavor, and flavor plays a big role in, like, stimulating our hunger. If you have a candy bar, it's not just like the sugar and everything that makes you hungry after that. It's that's a hyper palatable food, and your brain, it's like a drug. Your brain's like, dopamine dump, I want more.
Right.
And if you're on a carnivore diet and you go back to, you're basically on like one of the lowest, I guess, flavor profile diets you can be on. Even just going back to, let's say, a keto diet or a low carb diet, those foods that you start incorporating back in are going to have so much flavor in them that I've noticed that it tends to stimulate a little bit more hunger.
For
I
sure.
think that's a good thing though too, because I really think our diet should be a little bit cyclical, right? I think we should go through periods of time where we're in a deficit, in a surplus, at
Mhm.
maintenance. Like, that's what our ancestors would have had to do. I think that's, depending on what your lifestyle looks like, I think that's what most of us should be doing too. So, I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. Especially if you have exercise in there, it's got to match that. And like you said, we did live through seasons where
Mhm.
there were times when there was a food deficit. There was a lack of availability, and then all of a sudden spring hits. There's hay more. Then things come into season in the late summer and early fall. The problem with most people, winter never comes. They eat for winter. They're
Yeah.
eating like it's late summer, early fall. They're eating the fruit. They're putting on their fat for winter. They're eating high nutrient or caloric dense foods. Winter never comes.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. The winter never comes, because
It
it really
just
is true. I mean, we don't have a calorie problem in the United States. Like,
Yeah.
that used to be an issue, and I mean, that is kind of why we are where we are today, is because we tried to solve that issue, and now we have so much food availability that even if you are somebody who is, that if you don't have a lot of money, you still are going to have access to plenty of calories. We have a nutrient problem is the issue.
nutrient poor. Yeah, micronutrient poor, protein poor.
Yep.
Um, and again, the high fat, high carb, dense,
Yep.
and that's what we're feeding. And then we see that play out in our public health, don't we?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's why you look at the way that we are. I mean, it's like, what, one third, or 1 in 3, I think, are pre-diabetic now, which is just an insane number when you think about it. That one in
Yeah.
three people in the United States are pre-diabetic. But not. But then, if you have any understanding of the way that our diet recommendations are, and what food is available to people, you're not surprised at all, because that's, if we're all eating a ton of processed carbs, we can all expect to be on a path towards diabetes, right? Like if that's where the bulk of our calories are coming from, that's just what's going to happen. So
Right.
not a huge surprise there, but it's kind of an
Right.
unfortunate truth.
Yeah. And you don't have to be obese to hit it either. It's
No.
just, it's more about visceral fat and that kind of, the hormonal element where we're stimulating. It's not caloric, it's a hormonal battle where
Yeah.
we have the insulin stimulated and building visceral fat around our liver. So in the gut, it's not necessarily billowing off your arms and legs, but it's building up around your liver.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, fatty liver disease is a big one too. Like, and that's something that, that didn't used to be a thing. Like fatty liver disease wasn't a thing until we started changing the way that we eat. And now, it is. And, a lot of even our thoughts on how that, we assume that's from fat and cholesterol and saturated fat and everything like that. And that's not the case either. So, yeah, it's crazy. And you're right. I think that, obesity is definitely a common predictor of metabolic dysfunction, right? So diabetes or metabolic syndrome. But you're right. There's plenty of people out there who, on the outside look very healthy, and on the inside they're an absolute wreck, right? Like, the human body is rather resilient, and there's some people who can, really trash their body for years and still look pretty good. But if you were to take a blood test of them, you'd be like, holy crap, So it's not just about, that used to be the thing, right? It's like stay skinny and you'll be healthy, but unfortunately, that's not the case anymore.
Not at all. You got to look at triglycerides and fasting insulin yeah, we're getting more into quality of what we're looking at. Not just looking at cholesterol number, large number, but look at particle size or particle numbers, triglyceride to HDL ratios, that kind of thing. So, and insulin levels, and that can all be under the surface. When we have a third of our country pre-diabetic, if they continue to eat that way and the way we treat it medically as a system, it will be a progressive disease.
Oh yeah,
it's progressive. So those pre-diabetic will become diabetic.
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. And because I mean, you look at like, I saw somebody post the other day, it was like a nurse who posted a picture of like the typical hospital meal for somebody who's a diabetic. And it's like, orange juice, Rice Krispie, cereal, like a bagel, a white bagel,
Yeah,
all these things. So it's
they'll
like,
give them pancakes with sugar-free syrup, basically.
Right. Yeah. I always love that one. Yeah. It's like you have, 400 grams of sugar on this plate, but we got sugar-free syrup at least, right? But you're right. I mean, the way that we treat it now is, and some of this is, it's easy to put the blame on the system, and no doubt the system is deeply flawed, but a lot of it's human nature too. I mean, we can now live with diabetes for decades, not live a high quality of life, but you can live with diabetes for a long time. And for some people, they would rather I'll take my insulin and eat my donut, and that's going to be okay with me for the rest of my life. But I mean, what we don't understand is the economic burden of that too. I mean, not only are we talking about low quality of life, but the economic burden. I mean, I think the average cost for a diabetic patient is like $250,000 a year. So when you start talking about, the 1 in 3 people are on the path towards that disease, we know that like things aren't going to get better when it comes to, like our debt and, the way that our healthcare system operates and everything like that.
Right.
So yeah, it's diabetes is a scary thing. And it's one of those things that it's starting younger and younger too, which is crazy. I mean, the instances of, the instances of gestational diabetes during pregnancy is higher now than it's ever been. But then also just, diabetes in children is happening. Pediatric diabetes is happening so much more frequently, it's just sad too, because in a lot of those cases, it's like, the kid doesn't have a fighting chance, right? It's almost that he was kind of born into this is what this is what I'm eating.
This is his lifestyle. It's his family lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so those are almost, some of the most disheartening ones, but yeah, I mean, I guess that's why we do what we do though, right? Try to change it if we can.
Well, that's just it. And a lot of people don't realize what with these diets we're talking about, you see people reverse diabetes, reverse type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely.
They'll reverse it. They'll bring the triglycerides back into play. They can improve their calcium score. They can lower their fasting insulin levels and get off of these medications. They won't need them anymore and manage their health without diabetic medications, without blood pressure meds, with just a healthy lifestyle. Not food, sleep, movement, all those elements coming together. That is what we do. It's like, let's reverse disease and actually make an impact. And so Man,
Which is
that's
totally possible too. You know, I think that everybody thinks that you can't do that through nutrition measures, which I think is partly because we don't want to believe that we can do anything ourselves. Like it's easier to put the burden on somebody else to make us healthy, right? Like this is the
right.
doctor's problem, not ours. But I mean, you look at a company like Virta Health, and their studies showing that their ability to reverse type 2 diabetes, which some people would say you couldn't reverse it, but what they're labeling as reversing is getting fasting blood glucose back into a healthy range, getting HbA1c, which is the most common diabetic marker, back under control, and then getting off of blood pressure medication, which in my mind, I'm not sorry, not blood pressure medication, getting off of diabetic medication,
Right.
which in my mind is reversing type 2 diabetes.
For sure.
And they're doing that with low carb dieting, with just trying to switch people away from the standard American diet. And
Right.
and if talking about the economics of that too, there's a great book out there called Curable by Travis Christofferson
Mm.
that talks a lot about the just some of the healthcare industry and how we've gotten where we are. And he does some really cool like little case studies where I think it was the hospital. I may butcher this part, but it was a hospital up in Minnesota or somewhere up north that was doing what they called the pharmacy for people, which was pharmacy as an FARM pharmacy, where
Yeah.
giving diabetics giving them like a budget for them and their families to buy healthy foods from like this local, I don't know where they were getting it from, and the rates of improvement in their disease was through the roof, and the cost of that was like it was something like $27,000 or $37,000 a year compared to that $250,000 a year with traditional treatment. So there's so much that's great about this. It's not just the health standpoint, but also the economics of it. I think is tremendous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's valuable. Hopefully more and more people. Jason Fung with the
Mhm.
fasted method. I mean, they've been reversing diabetes for a decade now,
Yeah,
and it's fasting and a low carb diet. And it's just that simple of a process to let your body heal itself, essentially.
right. Yeah, and I think what we kind of miss sometimes is we don't really look at pathologies of diseases anymore, right? To understand like what's causing diabetes. I mean, if you look at how diabetes occurs, it becomes pretty easy to understand what you could do to reduce your symptoms or improve, right? I mean,
Mhm.
insulin resistance is the driver of it, which it is. What are the things that cause insulin resistance? Well, the two biggest ones is overconsumption of carbs and that linoleic acid we talked about earlier, right?
Mhm.
So simply starting to eat whole food, real foods, you're going to see that stuff get better. Like you will, not that you shouldn't do a lot of the calorie counting and all this stuff, but if you could throw all that stuff aside and just eat, meat and vegetables, and so many of your health issues are going to go to the wayside. Now, you may have some specific cases of somebody with autoimmune condition or a gut health issue where they may have to go the extreme level of keto or of carnivore, or they may have to their blood sugar so out of check that they really need to go deep into ketosis to get it fixed. But most people just making a simple switch to, hey, I'm eating plants and animals, and that's where I'm going to be getting my food, my calories from,
Mhm.
that solves so many issues. So it really can be simpler than what a lot of us make it out to be.
And plants, you mean like green vegetable plants, not grains, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, this has been fantastic. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your knowledge and what you do. Cause again, you're a research guy, you create a lot of content, and how do people find you? What's the best way to direct them towards you?
Yeah. So, my Instagram at the ketologist is where I put out most of my like infographics that we were talking about at
Mhm.
the beginning of this. I also have a website that's theketologist.com, which, from there you can kind of get to. I have a newsletter called Thinking Nutrition, which is a kind of a health philosophy newsletter that you can sign up for there. I have some programs and a coaching program there that you can check out. And then also have my book Keto Answers that is on Amazon.
Okay.
And I do actually have to give one more plug to me
Sure.
and my little niece just published a little children's book called "Mommy, Do I Have to Eat This?" And it came last week. So it was something that me and my niece did during COVID. They had the COVID lockdowns, so pretty excited about that.
Definitely a great one. How many times I've been asked that, of course, daddy version, but I mean, it's like, do I have to eat this?
Yes, you do.
So that's awesome. I'll have to check that out because that's I'll definitely link out to the books, the Amazon book, and maybe some of this, and definitely to your website so people can get that information. I know people like to back that up, especially I got some nerdy people here. Listen, you got some real good, which I appreciate, having some nerds who are like, part of the choir, they love having the info and to dig deeper. So you're gonna be a great resource for them. So thanks so much, Chris. I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Zane.
Absolutely.